A few moments ago in our devotional reading, hopefully, the historical event that is mentioned in the book of Numbers surrounding that period of time in which the children of Israel have been blessed to be freed from Egyptian bondage under the leadership of Moses. They have been blessed to see the Red Sea open before them, to march through on dry ground, to see the armies of Pharaoh, along with Pharaoh, right behind them, to be swallowed up in the Red Sea, to be able to stand and to view Mount Sinai, the smoke that encompasses the heights of that mountain, to hear the thunder and to know that it is the communing that has taken place between the God of heaven and their great lawgiver that's taken place in the mountain, to receive the law and all that's contained in it, to be provided with everything throughout this whole period of time that they need, but because of a failure to get what they wanted, they murmured against God, and they murmured against God's appointed representatives in their leadership in Moses and also in Aaron. And it was because of their mourning against the leadership, griping and complaining, thinking back to all the good things that existed while they were slaves to the Egyptians, failing to realize that they were treated contemptibly, failing to realize that they were not getting one day off a week as was prescribed by the law of Moses, failing to realize that they had hard taskmasters that was increasing their burdens, and it was for the very reason that they cried out for relief that God provided them with relief and deliverance from Egyptian bondage. Nonetheless, they complained. They complained to the extent that to get their attention and to punish them for their murmuring and complaining, God sent serpents amongst them that when they were bitten, they suffered terribly from the bites and they died. Now we know, for whatsoever things were written aforetime, were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Romans chapter 15, verse 4. All these things happen for examples, and they're written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the world are come, as Paul wrote to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11. So we know that while this is a historical account, we know that we can find benefit in looking at the historical account and making application of the principles of this historical account to our day and age. And that's what we want to do in our lesson this evening. How did the children of Israel respond in the face of this terrible calamity of being bitten by these serpents and dying? Well, if you'll continue to read with me in the 21st chapter of the book of Numbers, we're going to read verses 7 through 9. Numbers chapter 21, verses 7 through 9, and see if there is not something that, for the most part, the children of Israel do here, which is something that is very noticeably absent, sadly, in the world in which we live today. Therefore, and remember, every time you see that word, you ask in your mind, what is that therefore? That's the question. Because it is a connecting word. It's connecting what has been said previously with what's being said now. Therefore, the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that He take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if the serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Now, did you notice the three words that describes the attitude of these people who were suffering this very painful snake bite as well as death? Yes, it's the word, we have sinned. Well, they were simply stating a fact, weren't they? And while it is a fact that they are stating, sadly, we live in a world in which people have great difficulty expressing the same fact, when it's just as true as it was during the days of being bitten by the fiery serpents. As a matter of fact, when you go and look at the various instances and the various people who were brought to the point where they were willing to do just as these people were willing to do, the numbers that are willing to do that are few and far between. And it might surprise us to see some of those who at least gave verbal support to recognizing the enormity of their sin. Take, for example, earlier in Exodus chapter 9 at verse 27, a man by the name of Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in the face of the plagues that were coming upon the children of the Egyptians, and said to Moses and Aaron, I have sinned. Now, from what transpires after this pronouncement that Pharaoh makes, then it's more than likely that what Pharaoh is doing on this occasion is what is often done in situations similar to these. He is reporting as to an occurrence that he's guilty of. Not that he's repenting, he's simply reporting that he has sinned. Because he turns right around and does the same thing over and over and over again. It's as if he doesn't really feel bad for the circumstances that are coming upon the children of Israel, or the children of the Egyptians, but he feels bad for the indignities that he's facing as the king of the Egyptians. There's a difference between reporting and repenting. And a failure to see that distinction is one that causes turmoil in our day, for sure. There's as well, in the very next chapter of the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 22, we are introduced to a man by the name of Balaam. Balaam, of course, was enticed by Balak, who was the king of the Moabites, to curse God's people. He refused to do so. And yet, as money was dangled before his nose, this enticement was just too much for him, or at least he thought, and he succumbed to the temptation that the money was going to be provided for him. And lo and behold, in the 22nd chapter, we read where he, in fact, is in conversation with the animal, a beast of burden on which he's riding. And when he realizes that the reason why the animal is bowing up and will not proceed any further through this tight squeeze on the road, that the angel of the Lord stands in his way, Balaam himself says, I have sinned. Now, it took the recognition that it was not a problem with the animal that he was riding on that had caused the grief that he was experiencing. It was his own problem that was causing the grief that he was experiencing. It was his own sins that brought him to the conclusion that he had sinned and needed to do something about that sin of which he was guilty. Later on, in the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 7 at verse 20, we read that as God had promised the children of Israel great success as they entered into the land of Canaan, that he would in fact be as a general running before them as a hornet before the people. And his success was met with disobedience by one man and his household. God said that the first city that was taken by the Israelites was his city. And they were to get no spoil from that city. And the principle is this: the first fruits belong unto the Lord. Therefore, everything that was taken spoil from the city of Jericho was God's. And that means that if it's God, it's not Achan and his family. And yet Achan saw that wedge of gold, saw that uniform of great beauty and great worth, and he just took it. And yet when he was finally found out, he too said, I have sinned. As a matter of fact, to go through the Bible and see the examples of those who were brought to the realization of their sinful condition, and they at least made that affirmation, is a lesson in and of itself. One that comes to mind oftentimes is when the prophet Nathan went to King David and told him this pitiful, pitiful story of a rich man who had no telling how many animals that he owned. And yet, when he had a visitor to come to his house, instead of going into his herds and taking some of the abundance of the animals that he had, he went and got his neighbors, his poor neighbors, only little lamb that was like a child to his neighbor, that lived in the house with him, a pet, as it were. And he killed that lamb and fed it to his house guests. David was enraged. The very idea. Tell me what his name is. Tell me where he lives. This man will die for this dastardly deed that he's done. And of course, Nathan said, Thou art the man, David. All the women of the kingdom at your fingertips. And yet here is Uriah the Hittite, one of the most valiant soldiers in your army. And you go and steal another man's wife. And you make her your own. And then set him in the front of battle when he will not go home to his wife to cover up this relationship and the child that has been produced by it. And now you have committed murder on top of adultery. Thou art the man. And while I think it's natural for us to have some degree of reservation about feeling sorry for David, for something that transpired very soon after this took place, and the child that was born to that adulterous union, of course, died. But then there was another child that was born. And do you know what he named that second child that was born? Not Solomon. Nathan. That tells you something about what kind of man that David was. He could not even call his son's name without remembering the terrible things that he did that was brought to his attention by Nathan. I started working on a sermon, and it was too difficult. If we were going to name a child after someone or something that brought our sin the most vividly to our eyes, what would our children's name be? Would we be man enough? Would we have the guts enough to say the name of the person who brought us the lowest and exposing our sin in the most vile way? Tells us something about David. But David said, I have sinned. Do you think that David was reporting his sin? Or do you think that this was going along the line of repenting of his sin? Well, without a doubt, there are many people who throughout Bible history were brought to the point where they said, just as these Israelites said, we have sinned. But was that the cure? If them making it aware that they had in fact come to realize that it was the wrong thing for them to do, to speak against the Lord, it was the wrong thing for them to do, to speak against Aaron and Moses and all of these others who were in the position that they'd been placed in as leaders of the children of Israel, was there anything more required than that? Or was that the cure right there? No. There was something else that was required. That which was required was that Moses was told to fashion a brass serpent and to place it on a pole and to put it in the midst of the camp. And when someone had been bitten by these fiery serpents, if they beheld or looked upon that brass serpent, they would be healed of their snake bite. Pretty simple arrangement, wasn't it? But yet, have you ever thought as to what would have happened had that situation so clearly set forth in the days of Moses and the children of Israel? Have you ever thought what had happened if that same situation would be in existence in our days today? Think about it with me, if you will. Somebody says, well, I just don't believe any such thing as that. My God is powerful enough to save me here in my tent just as much as He can save me out there looking at that silly snake on a pole. How many children of Israel do you think that once they were bitten by that snake bite would say, I have enough faith to be saved right here laying in my bed in my tent as I do out there looking at a silly snake on a pole? What do you think would have been the situation with them? There's no doubt about it. They'd have died in their tent. That's what would have happened. Another would say, well, that sounds like snake salvation to me. I don't believe that God's going to save an old snake. I think He's going to have to save me by His wonderful grace. And if He can't save me by His grace without the use of a snake, then I'll just die lost. And he would have died, wouldn't he? And while it sounds so ludicrous for us to even suppose that someone would make such an argument as that among the children of Israel, are those not things that people say today? Surely. And they make about as much sense as it would have made during that day as well. Have you ever thought that there might have been some, if they reason like they do today, they'd say, well, now, I just don't think that we need to do anything like that because, after all, that would be a violation of the Ten Commandments. Someone says, no, wait a minute. That's a violation of the Ten Commandments? He said, yes, thou shalt not make unto me any graven image. Well, granted, what ended up happening with this brass serpent is it did end up becoming an object of their worship. But friends and brethren, it was not an object of worship as it was set in the middle of the camp, and the children of Israel were told to gaze upon it and they would be saved. They knew that their faith was saving them, but their faith made necessary them looking at the snake that was on the pole. So it was not a violation of any such thing as the Ten Commandments. Notice as well, someone would say, well, I just don't think that we ought to do anything like that. Sin's out. It was a serpent that deceived Eve in the Garden of Eden. And I just don't think that God would use a snake to accomplish the relief of a snake bite and death, since it was a serpent that led Mother Eve astray. Well, friends, you can come up with all kinds of goofball ideas to get around doing what God said do. But it's not going to discount from the fact nor set aside what God said for the children of Israel to do in regards to being bit by the snake. They had to view the serpent on a pole, or else they were going to die. And then there would have been that more liberal-minded folk among the group who would say, why do we have to look at that serpent? I mean, one serpent's just as good as another serpent. Why do we have to go and look at that one? Can't we look at one over here somewhere? And why does it have to be on a pole? Can't it be crawling along the ground? We know well that if any of the children of Israel wanted to be cured of the fiery serpent bite, then they would do just exactly what God told them to do through His spokesman, Moses, on this occasion. Get out of their tent? Yep, they'd get out of their tent. I guarantee you, if they had to have somebody to carry them because they were so weak they could not make it on their own, they would have got somebody to tote them out to the midst of the camp so that they could look on the serpent and be healed of their snake bite. Granted, that is not a way that people had been before saved from being killed by being bit by a snake. Nor do we have any indication that after this occasion there was people who were saved from snake bite by looking on a snake. But granted, on this occasion, this was God's prescribed way for being delivered from certain death by being bitten by these fiery serpents. And until they submitted to the will of Almighty God, they were not going to be healed of this terrible bite. Now, interestingly, in the 3rd chapter of the book of John, none other than Jesus Christ Himself makes a comparison of this historical event to Himself. When He says, begin at verse 14, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God so loved the world, that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Would it surprise us that some of these foolish ways of reasoning that people would use to get around snake bite, prescribed way to deal with it, as God said, would likewise be used by people today to get around the simple plan that God has for removing the guilt of sin that will doom and damn our very souls? As we pointed out this morning, and will continue to do so because it will remain this way until the Lord returns. When a person desires to enjoy the forgiveness of his sins, he must believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He must be willing to repent of his sins. He must be willing to confess with his mouth what he believes in his heart, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and he must be willing to be baptized into Christ so that his sins might be remitted and so that he might be added by the Lord to the Lord's called out people, to the Lord's church. And while there are millions of people who have been duped and deceived into believing some other way and have made fun of that clear and undeniable plan that God has given, just as surely as it was necessary for the Israelites long ago to gaze upon that brass serpent in order to be healed of the snake bite, even so must we obey the simple commands of the gospel in order to be saved from the sting of sin. Have you obeyed that simple gospel plan? If not, why not? Sometimes people will say it only took one sermon throughout the book of Acts, one sermon, and people obeyed the gospel. One sermon, and people obeyed the gospel. Maybe we need to step back from that and think about it in a little bit broader detail. Those on Pentecost Day in Acts chapter 2 were not just that day introduced to the God of heaven, were they? No. But the fact that they were assembled on Pentecost in the city of Jerusalem was a pretty good indication that they had been schooled in God, the Creator, and God speaking to the children of Israel and providing under Judaism a covenant people for the preparation until the appointed seed should come. And with many other words did Peter testify and exhort, saying, save yourselves from this untoward generation. And while there is only a part of the sermon that is included there, we would be wrong to think that a person could understand from knowing absolutely nothing to knowing all they need to know within a 15 or 20 minute period of time. That simply is not the case. And yet we have examples like the Philippian jailer, Acts chapter 16, who by no stretch of the imagination was a religious man. And yet as these beaten preachers went home with him that night, before the next day dawned, these Gentile households had received forgiveness of their sins in hearing the gospel preached by Paul and by Silas. What is it that stands between you and obedience to the gospel? Is it you don't know enough yet? Is it that you need some questions answered? And once those questions are answered, then you'll be willing to respond to heaven's invitation? Whatever it is that stands between a person and they're enjoying the forgiveness of their sins so that they can, with a pure and a clean heart, pillow their head at night with a realization that just as the childless prayer oftentimes goes, if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Whatever it is, take care of it, and take care of it tonight. Even right now, while we stand and while we sing.